In our conversation over character education, it's really important to get our terminology right. Here we're going to dig a bit deeper into whether we should use the terms character education or spiritual formation. Way back in 1987, 23 scholars from a variety of Christian traditions gathered at an ATS-sponsored issues research seminar. And this was one of the issues on the table. David Kelsey, and many of you know him from his writings on theological education, was there at this consultation as an observer, and he wrote a summary of what he heard. You can find a link below here to the EBSCO journal article, as well as to the entire volume of the journal Theological Education, where there's a full set of papers. What I'm going to do in this post is to try to summarize the summary of David Kelsey in a few minutes for you. So firstly, just to say that there was agreement on the word formation. I will make a case separately where I think the word character education is probably the one that we're going to be using rather than formation. But formation there was agreement on. Where there was not agreement in this particular consultation was whether to use the term character formation, spiritual formation, or even soul formation. And each one of these came with a number of variations as can be imagined. So here's the spoiler. Character emerged from the consultation as the best term to think of holistic formation. But that's not enough. You obviously want to engage a little more with the conversation. So here's a bit of the taste of the conversation, and I'll take them in inverse order. I'll start with the last term, soul, and then we'll look at the term spiritual, and finally with the term character. So the term soul was suggested as a substitute for the term character, and hence to speak about soul formation. And the basic definition of soul was a subject in process. And any of you familiar with some of Plato's writings will immediately see that this is quite similar to some Platonic thinking, and the suggestions as to how to go about practically in soul formation were also quite Platonic. In the debate, this particular view, this suggestion for soul did not seem to have much traction, possibly because when we speak of soul, we immediately come up on a long and really complicated set of philosophical traditions. Personally, I also don't think this is a wise choice, simply because there's very little of the literature and of the debates that we're interested in that use this term. We would continue to have to do translation work between the literature and our particular version, should we use the word soul. So not the great future ahead, the choice of the word soul formation, but for completeness, it is certainly interesting to note the debates that surrounded this suggestion. So the second word is the word spiritual. The two main contendants in the discussion were spiritual formation and character formation. Now, for some, spiritual is to be preferred because it seems to bring character education closer to theological education. You say spiritual, and it seems much more fitting with theological. But it can also be argued that it does just the opposite, because what it can do is it can isolate character education as something that happens only within a religious tradition, instead of seeing the education of character as what it is. It's a broadly human enterprise. Sure, with a specific and special instances in the Christian tradition, but not exclusively a Christian thing. So spiritual certainly was a choice that many advocated for in this consultation, but the word spiritual itself is actually used in many different ways, and I encourage you to read the article if you want more. Here's just a real brief bullet list. The first use of spiritual was a pre-theological way, not tied to any particular worldview, and here we can even envision an approach to spirituality that can be seen as secular as well as religious. Second was a version of spiritual that was theologically generic and hence represented all religious traditions. So here we would look broadly for common denominators across different religious traditions as to what is identified as spiritual. And Thirdly, a theologically specific use of spiritual that is specifically tied to the Christian tradition. And this is probably where most of us that are following this blog sit. We are in the Christian tradition, and hence we would probably define a spiritual person, and here's a key distinction, in terms of their relationship with God. So we use spiritual when we're thinking of, if we can talk of a vertical relationship with God. And so spiritual formation is used to define a set of practices that nurture and deepen our relationship with God. This is good. It actually really helps our efforts to define. And I think what helps even more is a further set of distinctions that Kelsey draws out that he labels actually as Trinitarian, a set of Trinitarian distinctions in our Christian use of the term spiritual. And the graph that you can see now, it illustrates these three distinctions. So we can speak, for example, of a theocentric spirituality, which is God-focused. And this would include, for example, some of the mystical traditions and some of the practices that deepen directly the relationship with God the Father. Secondly, however, we can also speak of some pneumatically centered spirituality, which is actually spirit-focused. And this would include, for example, the charismatic experiences, and these as well, seen as those that draw us nearer in our relationship to God. But thirdly, and keep this in note, we can speak of a Christocentric spirituality. This is mostly focused on discipleship and on following Jesus. And this is also seen as a measure of spirituality. So keep this in mind. We're going to come back to this diagram in just a moment and see how it interfaces with character and the term character education. So when we come to character, again, the term is used in a variety of different ways. And if you want to unpack these, read more in the article. Again, a bullet list. First of all, character is used in a psychological sense that speaks of structured personalities that are formed at an early age. There is also, secondly, a social use of the term character, and this mostly speaks of modern individuality and autonomy. The one that's probably most interesting to us and closest to what we're trying to get at is the philosophical use of the term character. And this emerged quite clearly in consultation as the one that was most useful. What we find here is a tradition that runs from Plato and Aristotle to Aquinas and to many contemporary philosophers, and it places an emphasis on human agency. And therefore it defines character as a fairly settled set of dispositions, also called virtues or habitus, to reflectively act in certain ways in given circumstances. So if this is the definition that we're looking at for character, formation of character is therefore aimed at 1, helping our students understand dispositions, 2, helping them act in certain ways, 3, helping them develop in a settled way and therefore constancy in their actions, and 4, helping them develop a reflective practice where virtue is related to various situations. Now, we'll unpack this more in other posts, so this is just to mention here in terms of definitions, how character can actually be really helpful. This actually seemed to be the winner in the consultation as the term that is best fit for speaking of this kind of formation. Now, the reasons for why this particular ATS consultation opted for character as the best term are not spelt out clearly in Kelsey's summary. So here's my summary of why I think it's important to nuance our definition and speak of character education rather than the more general term spiritual formation. So I've got 3 reasons. 1, using the term character encompasses a broader tradition than the religious one. Although spiritual can also be used in a secular way, and we've mentioned that, it is mostly associated with the religious context. Whereas if we choose the term character, it keeps us within a broader conversation. Now that leads me to my second point. If we use the word character, it resonates with a broader range of literature, and it speaks to a broader audience. So that when we use the term character, when we use the term virtues, we immediately latch on to, for example, the entire classic and humanistic tradition. Many educational philosophers also use this sort of language. And we're also making an effort in bridge building to the contemporary educational and social science debates by using the term character. And thirdly and lastly, it offers, if we use the word character, it offers a helpful distinction within the Christian tradition of spiritual formation. So come back with me to the diagram that we saw when we talked about the Trinitarian distinction in spiritual formation, God-centered, Spirit-centered, and Christ-centered. I would argue that spiritual formation in theological education, the term, is best used to specifically describe the theocentric and Spirit-centered activities on this particular graph. These are aimed directly at cultivating the relationship with God. So when we speak of these, the term spiritual formation is appropriate. Character education, instead, you can see in the diagram I'm suggesting overlaps with the Christ-centered, discipleship-oriented focus. Notice it overlaps. It's not the same thing as discipleship. In some ways, discipleship is broader than character education. In other ways, discipleship is not quite as specific as character education. But in general, this is an area that is less directly God-related and more directed to actions, to dispositions, and to virtue habits, and therefore character. So, in conclusion, 3 candidate entities at this particular ATS consultation to focus our thinking on formation: soul, spiritual, character. The most useful, as it is specific to our task, is character. And for the purpose of this research, we will leave the label spiritual formation to cultivating one's relationship with God, and choose character education as a term we'll be using even in this blog to speak of cultivation of virtues within an expanded view of Christian discipleship.